Elizabeth Coulter was 41 years old and had $11 to her name when her brother-in-law nailed her trunk shut on the porch and told her the house was his. It was March of 1886, and the wind coming down off the Bitterroot foothills still carried the teeth of winter, and Nathaniel Coulter stood in the doorway of the house her husband had built with his own two hands and said that grief did not pay debts, and neither did a woman's tears. She left with a wool coat, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a tin of her husband's tools, and the $11 folded into her glove. 3 days later, in the town of Ashford Creek, Montana Territory, she stood before the courthouse steps and watched the auctioneer knock down the old Hargrove forge. Condemned, roof half fallen, chimney bricked shut for reasons no one living could explain, for the price of $9, and she was the one who raised her hand and bought it. The men on the steps laughed. They called her a fool, a madwoman throwing away her last coin on a ruin nobody else would touch. What none of them knew, what she herself could not have guessed as she walked toward that broken building in the fading light, was that sealed behind that chimney's blackened bricks lay a secret that had waited 20 years to be found, one that would not only change the shape of her own life, but would settle a debt the whole town of Ashford Creek did not even know it was owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elizabeth Coulter. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, a home, a town, or even a piece of yourself that others have written off as worthless, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Elizabeth had been born Elizabeth in Whitfield in the spring of 1845, in a narrow valley in western Pennsylvania where her father, Ambrose Whitfield, kept the only forge for 11 miles in any direction. She was the third of 5 children and the only one who ever showed interest in the ring of the hammer, and so it was that by the age of 9 she was permitted, against her mother's protests, to stand at the edge of her father's shop and watch him work. Ambrose Whitfield was not a soft man, but he was a fair one, and he believed that a mind that wanted to learn ought not be turned away simply because it wore skirts instead of trousers. By 12, Elizabeth could build up a fire to the proper heat and knew the difference in color between iron ready for the hammer and iron that would only crumble beneath it. By 16, she could shoe a horse competently, though her father always finished the last nail himself, out of habit more than necessity, and told her privately that her hand was steadier than her brother's had ever been. It was in that forge, amid the smoke and the sparks and the low-churning heat of the coals, that Elizabeth learned the values that would carry her through every hardship still to come. Her father used to say that iron did not care where it came from. A horseshoe pulled from the mud, rusted and bent and thrown away by some careless traveler, could be heated and reshaped and made whole again, and no one who used it afterward would ever know it had once been cast aside as ruin. Nothing that can still hold heat, he told her once, turning a blackened scrap over in the tongs, is finished yet. She carried that lesson the way other girls carried hope chests, folded away and taken out again whenever she needed it. She married Thomas Coulter in 1867, when she was 22, a blacksmith himself who had come through the valley buying stock for a freighting outfit and had stayed 3 extra days simply to speak with her again. Thomas was a quiet man with a crooked smile and enormous, careful hands, and he did not seem the least bit troubled that his bride knew more about the tempering of steel than most men who called themselves smiths. They moved west together in 1870, following the promise of new towns rising along the freight roads that fed the mining camps of Montana Territory, and they settled at last in Ashford Creek, a town of perhaps 400 souls built along a creek bed that ran silver with runoff in the spring and nearly dry by August. Thomas opened a forge on the north end of the main street, and Elizabeth worked beside him in all but name, for propriety would not allow a woman to be called a blacksmith outright, though everyone in town knew whose hand had shaped half the tools and wagon fittings that came out of that shop. They had no children, a sorrow they carried quietly and without complaint, and instead poured themselves into the town itself, into the barn raisings and the church suppers, and the long winters when Thomas would forge extra fire pokers and door latches to give away to families who could not pay, because, as he liked to say, echoing something Elizabeth had told him her own father once said, a man's worth was not measured by what he charged for his labor, but by what he was willing to give of it. For 16 years they built a life together in Ashford Creek, modest but steady, respected if not wealthy, and Elizabeth believed, as most people believe in the quiet, unremarkable middle of their lives, that the shape of things would simply continue. Thomas fell ill in the autumn of 1885, a fever that came on slow and then took him fast, and by the time the frost had killed the last of the garden, Elizabeth was a widow. It was in the weeks following his death that she discovered how little the town's respect for her husband transferred to her, a widow with no children and no immediate family of her own within 1,000 miles. Nathaniel Coulter, Thomas's younger brother, arrived from Helena within the month, all sympathy and dark wool mourning clothes, and it was several weeks more before Elizabeth understood that his sympathy had been in service of an older grievance, that Nathaniel had never forgiven Thomas for leaving their father's failing freight business to strike out on his own, and had never forgiven Elizabeth for being, in his eyes, the woman who had encouraged that departure. He produced papers, hastily drawn and stamped by a lawyer in Helena, claiming that Thomas had borrowed against the forge and house years earlier to help their ailing father, a debt Elizabeth had never once heard mentioned in 16 years of marriage, and that the debt, unpaid, now entitled him to the property. She had no papers of her own to contradict him, no proof beyond her own memory and her own certainty, and in a territory where a woman's word carried the weight of wind against a man's signed document, she found she had no ground to stand on at all. The town's lawyer, a tired, decent man named Corwin, told her privately that he believed her, but belief was not evidence, and evidence was what the circuit judge would want when the matter came before him in the spring. Rather than wait out a winter as a guest in the home that was no longer hers, enduring Nathaniel's cold civility at every meal, Elizabeth packed what little she was permitted to take and left before the first snow. She spent the winter boarding with the widow Halloran on the edge of town, taking in mending and doing what smith work she could manage quietly in a neighbor's shed, work that paid in coins so thin it barely covered her keep. It was, she would say later, the hardest season of her life, harder in some ways than losing Thomas himself, because grief at least had the decency to be honest about what it had taken from her, while this new poverty seemed determined to strip away not just her home, but her sense of who she was. She had been a blacksmith's wife, a woman known and respected in a town she had helped to build, and now she was simply a widow with $11 and a tin of tools, waiting for a courthouse auction to see what little scraps of her old life might come up for sale. When the notice went up for the county tax auction in March, she had gone, she told herself, only to see what remained of the world she had lost. Perhaps some piece of Thomas's old equipment sold off for debts, perhaps nothing at all. She had not expected to find herself standing before the ruin of a building she barely remembered, one that had sat condemned and empty at the edge of town for as long as she had lived there, the old Hargrove Forge, abandoned since before she and Thomas had ever arrived in Ashford Creek. No one could tell her precisely what had happened to Silas Hargrove, only that he had been the town's original blacksmith, back when Ashford Creek was little more than a scattering of tents and a hopeful assay office, and that sometime in the mid-1860s, during the hard years of a mining dispute that had nearly torn the young settlement apart, he had simply vanished. Some said he had gone east. Some said he had died alone somewhere in the hills, his body never found. The building had stood empty ever since, its windows broken by boys with rocks, its roof caved in on the north side, its chimney bricked over at some point by persons unknown for reasons no living soul could name. It was worthless by every practical measure, a hazard the town would have been glad to have torn down had anyone been willing to pay for the labor. And so when the auctioneer called for bids that cold March morning, the only sound that answered him for a long moment was the wind. Elizabeth raised her hand almost before she had decided to do it, some old stubborn instinct rising up in her from her father's forge in Pennsylvania. The memory of him turning a ruined scrap of iron in his tongs and saying nothing that can still hold heat is finished yet. And she heard herself say $9 before she had fully weighed what it would mean to have 9 of her 11 remaining dollars tied up in a building most of the town considered cursed. The auctioneer, startled, asked if she was certain. The small crowd gathered on the courthouse steps laughed outright, one man remarking loudly enough for her to hear that the widow Coulter had gone soft in the head from grief, buying a haunted ruin no one else would touch with a 10-foot pole. Elizabeth kept her chin level and did not answer them. $9, going once, going twice, sold to the woman in the gray coat. And just like that, for the price of a good pair of boots, Elizabeth Coulter owned the old Hargrove Forge and the ridicule of half the town along with it. She walked to the building that same afternoon because she had nowhere else that required her presence and because some part of her needed to see, in daylight and without an audience, exactly what she had done. The forge sat at the edge of town where the road bent toward the creek, half shadowed by a stand of cottonwoods that had grown up wild and untended in the 2 decades since anyone had cared for the place. The door hung on one hinge and gave a long groan of protest when she pushed it open, and the inside smelled of dust and old ash and the particular mineral coldness of a hearth that has not held fire in a very long time. Sunlight came down through the broken roof in long dusty columns, and she stood for a while simply looking at the wreck of it. The collapsed forge bellows rotted to leather scraps, the anvil still standing solid and true in the center of the floor, as if daring time itself to move it. The workbench along the far wall buried under 2 decades of fallen plaster and roof debris. It was, by any sensible measure, a foolish purchase, and she allowed herself a moment of doubt so sharp it nearly buckled her knees, standing there with $2 left in the world and a roof that led in the sky. But then her eye fell on the anvil, still true after 20 years of neglect, and something in her steadied. An anvil did not lie, her father used to say. It simply waited for someone with the will to use it. It was on her 3rd day of clearing debris, working alone with a borrowed broom and her bare hands wrapped in rags against the splinters, that she came to the chimney. It rose along the eastern wall, built of good field stone at the base and brick above, and unlike every other feature of the ruined shop, it had clearly been sealed with purpose rather than left to decay. Someone had bricked over the flue opening entirely, mortared it closed with a neatness and care that stood in strange contrast to the abandonment surrounding it, as though the last act performed in that building before it was left to rot had been this one deliberate, careful thing. Elizabeth ran her hand over the brickwork and felt, more than saw, that it did not match the surrounding stonework in color or age, a slightly different clay, a slightly fresher mortar, though both had long since gone gray with time. She might have thought nothing more of it. An old repair, a fire hazard sealed off by some tenant she would never know, except that when she rapped her knuckles against the bricks, low near the hearth floor, the sound that came back was not the solid thud of stone packed against stone, but something hollower, something that spoke of empty space behind it. She did not open it that day. She told herself it was only curiosity, the same idle wondering anyone might feel about a strange feature in an old building. And she went back to sweeping ash and hauling broken plaster out to the yard. But that hollow sound stayed with her through the evening and followed her into a restless night at the widow Halloran's boarding house. She thought of Thomas, who had always said that a thing hidden was usually hidden on purpose, and that purpose deserved respect even when it could not be understood. She thought of Nathaniel Coulter's papers, forged or true, she still did not know, and how a document sealed away in a lawyer's drawer in Helena had been enough to strip her of everything she owned. Perhaps, she thought, there was some justice in the idea that a thing sealed away might also give something back. She returned the next morning with a mason's chisel from Thomas's old tin of tools and a lantern borrowed from the widow Halloran, and she worked at the bricks through the better part of the afternoon, prying them loose one by one with the same patient care her father had taught her to use when drawing a stubborn nail from good wood, careful not to damage whatever lay behind rather than simply to break through as fast as possible. The mortar, old as it was, had never fully cured against the damp chimney stone, and it crumbled more easily than she expected, brick after brick coming free in her chiseled hands until at last, with the light going gold and low through the broken roof, she uncovered a cavity built into the chimney's base, no larger than a small trunk, lined with a sheet of tin to keep out moisture, and inside it, wrapped in oiled canvas that had somehow survived 20 years nearly intact, she found a locked strongbox, and beside it, folded flat and dry, a leather satchel of papers. Her hands shook as she lifted them out into the lantern light. The strongbox was iron, plain, unmarked, its lock long rusted but not beyond hope of opening. The satchel, when she untied its cracked leather straps, held a bundle of papers written in a careful, sloping hand, the ink faded to brown but still legible, and on top of them, a single letter addressed, astonishingly, to whoever should find this. Elizabeth sat back on her heels on the ash-covered floor and read it by lantern light with the wind moving through the broken roof above her. And by the time she finished, she understood that she had not simply bought a ruined building for $9. She had bought a debt that Ashford Creek had owed for 20 years and never known it owed at all. The letter was signed Silas Hargrove, and it told a story Elizabeth had never heard in all her years in Ashford Creek, because it was a story no one left in town had any reason to tell. In the years before the town had a name it could rightly call its own, when it was only a huddle of tents and half-built cabins clustered around a hopeful vein of silver in the hills above the creek, the miners and homesteaders of the settlement had done what struggling communities on every frontier have always done. They had pooled what little they had into a common fund, coined by hard-earned coin, kept for the worst of emergencies. A bad winter, a mine collapse, a widow left with children and no way to feed them. Silas Hargrove, trusted by every family in the settlement for his honesty and his steady hand, had been chosen to hold that fund, and he had kept careful record of every contribution in the ledger Elizabeth now held in her lap. But in the winter of 1866, a man named Elias Pruitt, a land speculator who had bought up mineral rights across half the valley and who wanted the last of the independent claims for himself, had moved to seize the settlement's land through manipulated tax filings and a friendly judge in the territorial capital, and when the town's common fund had been poised to hire a lawyer and fight the seizure in court, Pruitt had sent men to find where that fund was kept, meaning to see it stolen or destroyed before it could be used against him. Silas Hargrove, warned in the night by a friend, had done the only thing he could think to do. He had taken the fund, sealed it, and the full ledger of every family's contribution into the chimney of his own forge, told no one but his letter where it lay, and fled the territory that same week, believing he would be hunted for the money himself, and intending, the letter said, to return within the year once Pruitt's scheme had played itself out, to unseal the chimney and restore the fund to its rightful families. He had never returned. The letter did not say why, only that if this letter was ever found, it meant he had not lived to keep his promise, and he asked, humbly and plainly, that whoever found it would see the fund restored to the descendants of the families listed in the ledger, and would forgive an old blacksmith for dying before he could finish what he started. Elizabeth sat a long while in the gathering dark, the lantern guttering low, and felt the full strange weight of what had been placed in her hands. The strongbox, when she finally worked its rusted lock free with a bent nail and a great deal of patience, held not a fortune in the way of Nathaniel Coulter's forged debts or Elias Pruitt's stolen mineral claims, but something steadier and, in its way, more remarkable, gold and silver coin totaling a little over $1,100, a sum that would have meant nothing to a speculator like Pruitt, but that represented, to the families who had scraped it together penny by penny in the hard years of the settlement's founding, something closer to their whole world. And beneath the coin, folded separately and marked in Hargrove's same careful hand, were copies of the original land claims of a dozen homesteading families, the very documents Elias Pruitt had tried to have voided through his manipulated tax filings, proof that the seizure had been built on falsified paperwork from the start. Elizabeth knew, sitting there in the ash and the lantern light, that she held in her hands not simply an old mystery solved, but a living grievance, because the name Pruitt had not vanished from Ashford Creek along with Elias. His son, Josiah Pruitt, now sat as the town's most prominent banker and, not incidentally, as the man who held the paper on a good third of the mortgages in the valley, including, as it happened, the note Nathaniel Coulter had used to justify seizing Thomas's estate. It did not take Elizabeth long to understand that if word of the Hargrove Fund and its buried land claims became known, it would not merely restore old debts to old families. It would raise very uncomfortable questions about exactly how the Pruitt family had come to own so much of the valley in the first place, and precisely what had become of an honest blacksmith who had tried to stand in their way 20 years before. She did not act rashly. She spent the following days quietly cross-referencing the names in Hargrove's ledger against the families still living in Ashford Creek, and found that though Silas Hargrove himself had left no descendants she could trace, nearly every other name in that ledger belonged to a family whose grandchildren still lived within a day's ride of the very land their forebears had nearly lost. She thought carefully, too, about what it would mean to bring this forward publicly, in a town that had laughed at her for buying a haunted ruin, in a territory where Josiah Pruitt's words still carried more legal weight than any widow's, no matter what proof she carried in a rusted strongbox. She went first, cautiously, to the lawyer Corwin, the same tired, decent man who had believed her about Nathaniel's forged debt and been unable to help her prove it, and watched his face change as he read through Hargrove's ledger and the copied land claims by the light of his office lamp. Watched 2 decades of quiet town gossip about a cursed forge and a vanished blacksmith rearrange themselves into something with hard edges and real names attached. It was Corwin who warned her that Josiah Pruitt would not simply step aside once he understood what she held. Word travels fast in a small town, faster still when it concerns land and money and old family names. And it was not 2 weeks after Elizabeth began her quiet inquiries before Josiah Pruitt himself came calling at the widow Halloran's boarding house, immaculate in a gray suit that had never known a day of honest labor, offering to buy the Hargrove property outright for $200, a sum so far beyond the building's worth that even the widow Halloran, listening from the next room, could not help but understand it as something closer to a bribe than a business offer. Elizabeth declined politely. Pruitt's manner cooled considerably at the refusal, and he made it clear, in the careful language of a man who had spent his life learning to threaten without ever quite saying a threatening word, that a woman alone, without family, without standing, without so much as a clear deed to prove her late husband's estate had been rightfully hers, would find life in Ashford Creek difficult indeed if she made herself an inconvenience to people of consequence. The following weeks tested Elizabeth in ways the winter of her widowhood had not. Word began to move through town, seeded, she suspected, by Pruitt's own quiet influence, that the widow Coulter had gone further than eccentric, that she was digging through a condemned building searching for buried gold like some deluded prospector, that grief had finally unmoored her reason entirely. 2 families she approached with news of their grandparents' place in Hargrove's ledger turned her away at the door, embarrassed and afraid to be associated with a woman the town had already half decided was mad, unwilling to risk the displeasure of a banker who held the paper on their own land. Corwin's office was broken into one night, nothing taken but a single drawer disturbed, and though nothing could be proven, both of them understood well enough what message had been intended. Elizabeth found herself, in the space of a single season, cast out once by her own family and now threatened by the most powerful man in her adopted town, and there were nights, alone in the cold ruin of the Hargrove forge with only the anvil for company, when she wondered whether Silas Hargrove himself had felt this same exhausted loneliness in the last days before he vanished, and whether his courage had simply run out before hers could. But Elizabeth had been raised at her father's forge to believe that iron did not care where it came from, that a thing thrown away could still be reshaped into something whole, and she found, turning that old lesson over in her mind through those difficult weeks, that it applied as much to a town's broken trust as it did to a bent horseshoe pulled from the mud. She began, quietly and patiently, to do the one thing that Josiah Pruitt could not easily threaten or buy his way around. She told the truth, plainly and without exaggeration, to anyone who would listen, starting with the families most directly named in Hargrove's ledger and working outward, showing them not accusations but evidence, copies of their own grandparents' land claims in a dead man's careful handwriting, proof that the fear which had kept their families cautious and small for 2 generations had been built on a theft, not a debt. She rebuilt the forge itself as she went, brick by brick and beam by beam, because a woman doing honest work with her hands was harder for gossip to dismiss than a woman merely making claims. And there was something else, too, something she could not entirely explain even to herself, in the way that raising the roof and firing the old hearth again felt like keeping a promise Silas Hargrove had died before he could finish. By early summer, enough families had come forward, quietly at first, and then with growing confidence, that Corwin was able to bring the matter before the circuit judge with more than one widow's word to support it. He brought the ledger, the copied land claims bearing county filing marks that predated Pruitt's supposedly legal seizures by a full year, and sworn statements from 3 families whose grandparents' names appeared in Hargrove's careful hand. Josiah Pruitt fought it, as Corwin had warned he would, with lawyers brought in from Helena, and a great deal of angry insistence that a widow's chimney treasure proved nothing about business conducted 20 years before he himself had come of age. But a falsified filing date is a stubborn thing to argue around once a judge has seen it laid beside the original in a dead man's own hand. And the paper trail Elias Pruitt had once used to steal a valley now unraveled just as plainly in his sons. The judge did not order Josiah Pruitt to prison, for the theft itself belonged legally to a father 2 decades dead, but he did order the disputed land claims restored to the families named in them, voided the fraudulent tax filings still on the county books, and, in a final stroke that Corwin later admitted gave him more satisfaction than nearly any ruling of his career, ordered a full audit of every mortgage Josiah Pruitt's bank held in the valley, an audit that turned up enough irregularity in the terms of Nathaniel Coulter's supposed debt against Thomas's estate that the note was thrown out entirely, the forgery exposed for what it was, and the house and the old family forge restored, at last, to Elizabeth Coulter's rightful name. It would be pleasant to say that justice arrived with thunder and fanfare, but it came instead the way most true justice does, quietly, in the dry language of a judge's ruling and the slow readjustment of a town's understanding, and Elizabeth found she did not much mind the quiet of it. What mattered to her was not the humbling of Josiah Pruitt, who left Ashford Creek within the year for reasons he never publicly explained, but the sight of the Cormier family, one of the 12 named in Hargrove's ledger, standing on their own restored land for the first time with their grandmother's original claim in their hands, weeping in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow. What mattered was the $1,100 of Hargrove's fund, divided at last among the descendants of the families who had scraped it together penny by penny a generation before, not enough to make any of them rich, but enough, in more than one case, to save a farm from foreclosure or send a daughter to a proper school for the first time. Elizabeth kept none of it for herself beyond what she had already spent restoring the forge, believing, as her father had taught her, and as Silas Hargrove's own letter had asked, that some debts belong to a community and not to whoever happens to find the ledger. And so it was that Elizabeth Coulter, 41 years old and cast out with $11 to her name, the woman the whole town had laughed at on the courthouse steps for spending her last coin on a haunted ruin, became instead the woman who reopened the old Hargrove forge under its own name once more, who taught 2 young girls from town the trade her own father had taught her 40 years before because she believed, as he had, that a mind eager to learn ought not be turned away for wearing skirts instead of trousers, and who never once, in all the years that followed, forgot the particular sound a hollow brick makes when it is struck by a hand that has learned to listen for what has been sealed away. She kept Hargrove's ledger on a shelf above her own workbench for the rest of her life, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, the same reminder her father had given her at the edge of his own forge decades before and a world away, that nothing which can still hold heat is ever truly finished, whether it is a bent horseshoe pulled from the mud, a chimney sealed and forgotten for 20 years, or a woman the world has decided to call crazy for believing that some ruins are worth saving. We began this story by telling you that Elizabeth Coulter was 41 years old and had nothing but $11 when the world cast her aside, and that she spent nearly all of it on a ruin nobody else would touch. We told you it would look, to everyone watching, like the act of a woman who had lost not only her husband but her good sense along with him. And perhaps, in the moment she raised her hand on those courthouse steps, even Elizabeth herself could not have said with certainty that she was doing anything wiser than surrendering to grief. But we have learned, in telling so many stories like hers, that the world is often too quick to mistake quiet faith for foolishness, and too slow to recognize that the things it throws away, old buildings, old ledgers, old women considered past their use, are very often exactly where its overlooked value has been waiting all along, patient as coals banked low beneath the ash, needing only someone willing to kneel down and blow the fire back to life. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Elizabeth Coulter tonight. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it, and we would love to know, in the comments below, what your own answer might be. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? We read every one of them, and we are always glad to know you are out there. Until next time, stay close.